was already recording. When did you start teaching at Dunbar?
I started teaching at Dunbar High School in Baltimore City in 1964.
Why did you choose to teach at Dunbar?
I didn't choose personally. I was selected to be department head of the social science department at Dunbar High School, and I accepted that position.
Who wanted you?
Well, the supervisor of social studies selected me and asked me if I would do it because I was told that I could work well with Negroes.
What were the conditions at Dunbar before 1965, which was before the programs to improve the school started?
At one time, Dunbar was in the segregated school system. Baltimore had a segregated school system. Blacks and whites did not attend school together, except for a few students at the Baltimore Polytechnic Institute in 1952. But Dunbar was one of the largest student had one of the largest student populations in the state. It had 3,000 students. And it was woefully crowded, not equipped very well. Most textbooks were handed down from the white schools. And under those circumstances, there were few, in those days, overhead projectors. There were few motion picture projectors. And I always remember that the heating system either did not work when I got there, or when it did work, the temperatures in the rooms were over 100 degrees.
Why was this considered a crisis period for Dunbar?
Because Dunbar had been a community school, not designated as a community school as we would say today, but had been a community school insofar as the surrounding neighborhood was. It was just down the street from Hopkins, and a lot of the parents worked at Hopkins. But this was a time of turmoil when there was a great push to integrate the schools. And most people did not want their children to go to formerly black schools. The element of racism and fear was there. I think that Dunbar had one white student, and that was all.
What was done to fix the crisis?
Well, Dunbar lost a lot of students to other high schools such as Patterson Park, Senior High, City. Some went to Poly. Others went to Northern and Eastern. So the population declined, and the building was a ruin. So there was a push by the community to build a new Dunbar, and that was done. I remember in the faculty meeting when this came up, I made the motion or moved the motion to build a new Dunbar High School. And the Parent Teachers Association, the students, and the school administration decided that they would support a new Dunbar High School. And it was built on Orleans Street. A few years later, of course, I had left by that time.
When was this done? Do you know about
This
how long
was
it
done
took?
in the late 60s, 1960s.
How did an end to segregation change the attitudes in Dunbar?
I don't think it changed attitudes too much. I think there were members of the community in West Baltimore, African American members in West Baltimore and East Baltimore, looked upon those schools as special places because they represented, I guess, I would say a beacon of hope for students, even though it was a segregated system. I don't believe that segregation ever died in many places because it was so ingrained in the fabric of American society, and including in Baltimore. Even today, I think schools are probably as segregated now as they were then because of the concentration of blacks in the inner city.
What were whites' reactions?
Well, initially in the 1950s, when there was the push for integration of the schools, there was resistance and a little violence. I remember at Southern High School, the principal at that time, Dr. John Schwatka, went from house to house trying to quell any violence that might occur. So there were tense situations. I do think the watershed event was the murder of Dr. King in 1968. I think that really, it was difficult to rebuild before Dr. King's death, and after Dr. King's death, it was infinitely more difficult to rebuild relationships between the white and black community. There were riots in Baltimore. Businesses and neighborhoods burned, and there was a general feeling of resentment and white flight from the city into the counties.
What were black reactions during this time?
Obviously anger, the more thoughtful people, sadness, but not surprised. As Rap Brown once said, that violence in America is as American as apple pie. Unfortunately, this is true.
What was actually being done in Dunbar to make it a better school other than just rebuilding it?
Well, a sense of pride. I think that the Dunbar team is today fighting for the crown for the Maryland Scholastic Association. There was a great deal of emphasis on black pride that can only come from those teachers who were dedicated to the image of blacks not only as citizens but as men and women of promise, and there would be a future, particularly with a new Dunbar, with the new facilities. I believe Dunbar has, the old building has just been, the old building that was built 40-some years ago has just been renovated.
Yeah, I read
But,
about that.
Under the circumstances, I have great respect for the students that I taught in those days and for the experience that I had during the civil rights movement.
Do you think they wanted to improve the school just because of the end of segregation?
No, they always wanted the best for their students, and they wanted the best facilities. But the reality of those days is that the separate but equal doctrine, separate facilities but equal, the equal was not so. They had hand-me-downs. I remember burning hundreds of ancient books that were then 40 years old, 40 and 50 years of age. Math texts, chemistry books, history books that were absolutely worthless, but had been used to provide an education for African Americans.
When they started the new programs, did they create a new curriculum for the students and get
Everything
new
was
books?
changed, yes. The evidence, well, I was responsible for a bylaw when I went on to the Maryland State Department of Education, integrating ethnic and cultural minorities into the curriculum of the schools. I helped get that passed and became a bylaw of the State Department of Education. And the schools integrated their literature with black literature, integrated their history books, and also gave recognition to scientists and mathematicians who happened to be black and had not had a place in the white culture, so to speak, until integration.
Did you ever teach anyone famous or?
Well, I taught Kurt Schmoke, who was mayor of Baltimore and I believe is now dean of the Howard Law School in D.C. And he was state's attorney in Baltimore City at one time, when I was at City College. And Mayor Burns, first black mayor of Baltimore City, was a colleague of mine at Dunbar High School. I knew him. And Dennis Crosby, who was the president of the American Federation of Teachers, taught there. And I was a member of the the American Federation of Teachers, and also Clarence Blount, who was the majority leader of the state senate in Annapolis. I'm sure that a lot of my students went on to great things, but as you know, you lose contact with people.
Do you think Dunbar has stayed in do you think Dunbar is like a good school now because of what people did back in the 60s?
I think they laid the groundwork for a great institution. And I believe that Hopkins has provided assistance to them. Many of my students I know were enrolled in programs as medical technicians to work at Hopkins.
Were you involved with any of the Hopkins Dunbar programs?
That came after I left. I left Dunbar in 1968 and became assistant principal at Booker T. Washington Junior High School in West Baltimore. And then I went to the Maryland State Department of Education as state supervisor of social studies.
Do you have any last comments or thoughts?
I treasure those days. My dad was a shoe repairman, and half his business were African Americans. We used to say Negroes in those days. And I was always comfortable with all the people that came to my father's shop. I think that laid the basis for getting along with people, knowing that bread and butter was being placed on your plate by a variety of people. And they were human beings just like you and should be treated accordingly with respect and dignity.
Thank you.
Thank you.